Hi everyone, my name is Denpa Archivist, aka Denpa. I'm a 24-year-old archivist and webmaster of the Denpa Archive, a NeoCities page which seeks to archive Denpa works such as visual novels, subcultural essays, manga, doujinshi, and more. And I was invited to speak a little bit about my work, about what exactly Denpa is, and the role that fan-translators play in the archival community. So without further ado, this is my presentation, Archiving the Signal, Preserving Denpa Culture in the Digital Age. So when someone asks, what is Denpa, you may not receive a succinct answer in the Western sphere. This is because Denpa is not a genre with fixed boundaries, but a cultural phenomenon whose meaning has continuously evolved. Most genre labels like science fiction, horror, and romance describe recognizable conventions, but Denpa is a little different. It has always been unstable, carrying historical, cultural, and psychological associations that resist neat categorization. Depending on the context, the word Denpa can translate to electromagnetic waves or radio waves, and this did not originate as a literary or artistic term. Its modern cultural meaning emerged in Japan through references to people who believed they were receiving invisible signals or messages. Over time, Denpa became slang, describing individuals perceived as disconnected from shared reality, and they were often associated with bizarre delusions or conspiratorial thinking. Importantly, this was never a clinical term. It was a piece of cultural slang, carrying both humor and stigma. It was kind of a derogatory term towards typically the disenfranchised or mentally ill. This distinction matters because many English-speaking fans unknowingly treat Denpa as though it were an officially recognized storytelling genre from Japan, when historically it was something a little messier. So rather than writing stories about radio waves specifically, artists became interested in experiences associated with Denpa, including but not limited to uncertainty, paranoia, social and emotional isolation, distorted perception, invisible forces, fragmented identity, and communication failure. So the signal itself became metaphorical. Characters begin questioning whether the world they're experiencing is genuine. Are they imagining things? Are unseen forces manipulating them? Can other people perceive their reality? Whether supernatural explanations exist often becomes less important than the character's deteriorating certainty. So an important thing to note is that Denpa is not a checklist. A misconception worth challenging is the tendency to reduce Denpa to its aesthetic features. Online discussions often describe Denpa as girls with blank expressions, such as Muko Aoi from Kimi to Kanojo no Koi, telephone poles carrying the Denpa waves, power lines, empty suburbs, static, unsettling music, glitches, and blood. While these images appear frequently in Denpa work, none of them actually define it. They're recurring visual languages, not requirements. A work can contain every one of these elements without exploring Denpa themes. Likewise, a work can contain none of them while still deeply engaging with Denpa's central concerns. This distinction is important because aesthetics are easy to imitate, but psychological experience is much harder. The Denpa experience often involves destabilizing the audience's confidence. Rather than frightening viewers through monsters or violence, Denpa frequently produces discomfort by making ordinary life feel fundamentally unreliable. Streetlights, schools, apartment buildings, telephone poles, convenience stores – nothing appears out of the ordinary, but everything feels suddenly misaligned, almost uncanny. The audience begins doubting not only the protagonist, but also themselves. Many fans first encountered the Denpa label through visual novels. Others discover it through anime recommendation lists or aesthetic edits on social media. Each community inherits only part of the larger picture. Some define Denpa entirely through horror, while others define it through psychological instability, surrealism, or internet aesthetics. These definitions often contradict one another because they're based on different entry points rather than shared historical contexts. This isn't necessarily a failure to define Denpa, but it reflects how cultural concepts evolve when they cross languages and communities. So the big question is Denpa even a genre at all? Maybe it is, maybe it isn't. Genres usually answer the question of, what kind of story is this? But Denpa instead answers something closer to, how does this story make you experience reality? That places it closer to an atmosphere, affect, or vibe rather than a traditional genre. A romance can feel Denpa, science fiction can be Denpa, slice of life and horror can be Denpa. The storytelling category changes, but the psychological relationship between the audience and reality remains. Communities often ask, what works count as Denpa? This may be the wrong question. Instead of treating Denpa as a membership in an exclusive club, it may be more productive to view works as participating in Denpa to varying degrees. Some works are foundational because they crystallize many of the ideas associated with Denpa, such as Shizuku, Jisatsu no tame no 101no Hoho, Tsui no Sora, Sayonara wo Oshiete. What's important to note is that Sayonara wo Oshiete was described as Denpa retroactively. It wasn't marketed as such, and Denpa works typically are never marketed as Denpa in the first place. Other works only borrow fragments. Others influence later creators without ever being labeled Denpa themselves, such as Sayonara wo Oshiete. This approach avoids rigid gatekeeping while still acknowledging historical influence. Denpa fiction is less interested in madness as a diagnosis than in what happens when a person's relationship with reality becomes uncertain. One of the biggest misconceptions surrounding Denpa is that it is simply fiction about insanity. While many Denpa stories feature psychologically distressed protagonists, their internal struggles are usually not the end goal. They are the mechanism through which the story explores perception itself. Instead of asking questions like, is this character mentally ill? Denpa encourages questions like, can perception ever be trusted? Does objective reality exist? How much of identity depends on shared reality? When does loneliness become its own reality? What happens when communication completely fails? Madness becomes philosophical rather than merely medical. Most fiction assumes that reality is stable. Characters may misunderstand events, but the audience usually understands objectively what is happening, but Denpa often removes this foundation. The audience receives information through characters whose perceptions may be distorted. A strange sound, a familiar face, a forgotten memory, a conversation. Nothing can be accepted at face value. This creates a unique relationship between audience and protagonist. Rather than observing someone who descends into uncertainty, the audience descends alongside them. Nearly every Denpa work begins with isolation, not necessarily physical isolation, social, emotional, and existential isolation. Characters often exist in ordinary environments such as schools, apartments, offices, suburban neighborhoods, and train stations. These are places designed for community. Ironically, they become spaces where communication repeatedly fail. Conversations become awkward, relationships fracture, people misunderstand each other, and silence grows louder than dialogue. Eventually, the protagonist occupies a world that feels populated but profoundly empty, and isolation becomes the condition that allows distorted reality to emerge. One fascinating feature of Denpa fiction is its refusal to rely on traditionally frightening settings. Instead of abandoned hospitals or haunted castles, we receive telephone poles, crosswalks, classrooms, empty playgrounds, convenience stores, and suburban intersections. These places are culturally familiar. Their horror comes from emotional estrangement rather than physical danger. The audience recognizes these environments, but the protagonist no longer does. This disconnect transforms ordinary life into something that's quietly terrifying. The world has not visibly changed, but through alienation, the relationship between person and world has. Denpa frequently introduces forces that may or may not exist. Voices, signals, prophecies, conspiracies, invisible organizations, alternate realities, divine intervention, technological interference. The brilliance is that definitive answers often never arrive. The audience remains trapped between explanations. Maybe supernatural events are occurring, maybe they're not. Maybe everything has a psychological explanation, maybe it doesn't. Maybe both of these interpretations remain equally valid. The uncertainty itself becomes the narrative engine. Many genres treat communication as a solution, but Denpa often portrays communication as fundamentally impossible. Characters repeatedly fail to understand each other, language becomes unreliable, memories conflict, intentions become obscured, truth cannot be verified. The result is profound loneliness. Characters are surrounded by people, yet remain psychologically unreachable. This inability to establish shared reality is often more frightening than any monster. So, one of the main reasons why Denpa feels so personal, at least to me specifically, is that many horror genres externalize fear, with a monster, a ghost, a killer, or something like that, but Denpa instead internalizes fear. The greatest threat becomes one's own consciousness. The audience cannot simply imagine escaping. Leaving the haunted house doesn't solve anything if the source of uncertainty comes from within, if it's perception itself. This is why Denpa often lingers after the story ends. It encourages audiences to momentarily question the assumptions that organize everyday experience. So I wanted to talk a little bit about my work as an archivist in archiving these Denpa works, because a lot of these works are what's called abandonware, which means that the original studio that created these works are defunct, or maybe the operating system that they operate on no longer work. So this is where archivists come in. So an archivist is somebody who preserves something, usually media, but other times it can be like physical objects, like in a museum, or books, like in a library. And archival work is more important than you realize. Archives are everywhere. Like I said, they're in museums, libraries, schools, academic journals, things like that. So I wanted to talk a little bit about the ethics of preservation. So the first thing that you should keep in mind when thinking about archives is that archives are never neutral. One of the biggest misconceptions is that archivists simply collect things. In reality, archivists make decisions. Every archive answers questions such as what deserves to be remembered, what isn't important enough to be saved, who gets represented, whose work disappears. Every inclusion is also an exclusion. This means that archives are not just passive collections, but they actively shape cultural memory. Future researchers often assume that what survives accurately represents the past, but it rarely does. What survives is often what someone chose to preserve. Another thing I wanted to touch on is that the digital age creates false confidence. People often assume that because something exists online, it will remain online forever, but the opposite is true. Digital media is remarkably fragile. Domains expire, servers shut down, hard drives fails, Adobe Flash disappears, forms close, image hosts vanish. Creators often delete their own work sometimes. Entire communities can disappear overnight. Unlike physical media, digital media can vanish completely without leaving fragments behind. Many Denpa works were never commercially distributed beyond small circles. Some existed only as downloads on personal websites. Others appeared briefly at events like Comiket before disappearing. Without preservation, they may simply cease to exist. One of the most difficult ethical questions concerns copyright. Suppose a visual novel released in 2003 has been out of print for 20 years. The developer no longer exists. No legal copies are available for purchase. No publisher remains. Is preserving it piracy? I mean, technically, yes, legally, but culturally, the answer becomes less straightforward. An archive is not replacing an active market. It is preserving something that has effectively fallen outside of public access. This tension exists across museums, libraries, and film preservation as well. Archives often seek to protect cultural memory. Archives can preserve materials responsibly without encouraging commercial exploitation or stripping creators of credit. For example, an archive might document a work's existence, record publication details, preserve screenshots or metadata, interview creators, or keep preservation copies under controlled access. These approaches differ significantly from reposting a creator's work without context or attribution. Ethics are shaped not only by what is preserved, but how and why. Fan-translators occupy a unique place in media preservation because they often become the first and sometimes only people to keep obscure works alive outside their country of origin. While translation is usually thought of an act of accessibility, it is also an act of preservation. A work that cannot be read by new audiences is at risk of fading from cultural memory, even if copies of it still physically exist. For many niche visual novels, doujinge, manga, and web-based works, fan translators step in where commercial publishers see little financial incentive. They spend months or years reverse engineering old software, extracting text from obsolete formats, researching historical and cultural references, and collaborating with editors, proofreaders, and hackers. In doing so, they preserve not just the words on the page, but the experience of the work itself. At the same time, fan translation, similarly to archival work, is never a neutral process. Every decision, how to render a joke, whether to keep honorifics, how to translate ambiguous dialogue, or how much cultural context to explain, shapes how future readers understand the original. A translation is not a transparent window into a work. It is an interpretation. For many international readers, a fan translation becomes the de facto version of that work, meaning translators inevitably influence its legacy. Fan translators also preserve the broader ecosystem surrounding a work. Translation projects often include scanned manuals, developer interviews, promotional materials, website archives, and production notes that might otherwise disappear. Many groups meticulously document technical hurdles, version differences, and historical context, creating records that are invaluable for future researchers and preservationists. The relationship between fan translators and preservation is not also without ethical complexity. Translators must balance respect for creators' rights with the reality that many of the works they preserve are long out of print, abandoned, or commercially inaccessible. Yet without these volunteer efforts, entire corners of Japanese digital culture, including many Denpa works, would remain invisible to the rest of the world. In this sense, fan translators are more than just language specialists. They are cultural mediators, historians, and archivists. Their work ensures that obscure stories are not only preserved as files on a hard drive, but remain readable, discussable, and capable of inspiring new generations of readers, scholars, and creators. So, if you listen to all that and you are interested in Denpa yourself, here's where you should start. A great source of information and the host to a variety of translated articles about the subject is the Denpa Archive, hosted by yours truly. The Denpa Archive is an independent digital archive and research project dedicated to documenting, preserving, and introducing the Denpa genre and its surrounding culture. It explores the broader ecosystem of Denpa: obscure games, manga, doujin works, magazines, websites, interviews, translations, historical context, and the creators and communities that shaped the movement. Some classic Denpa visual novels that you should definitely give a go are Jisatsu no tame no 101の方法、雫、Tsui no Sora, Sayonara o Oshiete, Sayo no Uta, Subahibi, and Kimi to Kanojo to Kanojo no Koi. Classic Denpa manga include Serial Experiments Lane, The Nightmare of Fabrication, Laichi Hikari Club, and Homunculus. So that's about everything that I had to say on the topic of Denpa itself and the culture surrounding Denpa preservation. If you have any questions, comments, or concerns, I'll be here for the roundtable after this presentation to discuss maybe some English language Denpa, such as American Psycho or House of Leaves. But I hope that this presentation was helpful in sort of explaining what exactly Denpa is and the efforts that I personally go to preserve it. Thank you again for watching. See you.